Arthur Sterling did not come to the Philippines to find himself. He came to find a return on investment. As a man who measured the world in spreadsheets and cold, hard data, he believed that everything and everyone had a price. He arrived in Manila with a suitcase full of contracts and a heart hardened by decades of corporate warfare, intending to consolidate his empire and leave as quickly as the humidity would allow. He looked out of the tinted window of his luxury SUV at the chaotic sprawl of the city, seeing only inefficiency where others saw life. He didn't know then that the very people he looked down upon were about to teach him a lesson that no Ivy League MBA ever could. He came to the Philippines to buy the land, but he would end up being captivated by the soul of the people who walked upon it. This is a story for anyone who has ever felt that success is measured by the size of a bank account rather than the depth of a connection. It is a chronicle of a man who thought he had everything, only to realize he was starving in the midst of plenty. If you believe that kindness is the only true language and that the greatest transformations happen when we finally let our guards down, subscribe to our channel as we explore stories that change the heart. Arthur Sterling sat in the back of his air-conditioned sanctuary, the leather seats of the black SUV humming with a sterile, expensive silence. Outside the glass, Manila was a fevered dream of neon lights, rusted jeepneys, and the thick, heavy scent of rain hitting parched asphalt. To Arthur, the city was a puzzle he had no interest in solving. He looked at the street vendors weaving through the gridlock, their faces slick with sweat as they sold jasmine garlands and bottled water, and he saw only a lack of ambition. He was here to finalize the acquisition of a local textile firm, a move that would streamline his production by cutting costs that were currently tied up in the livelihoods of 300 local families. To Arthur, these were not families. They were variables in an equation. He checked his watch, a timepiece worth more than the average worker earned in a lifetime, and sighed with the impatience of a man who believed the world revolved around his schedule. He viewed the Philippines as a mere stopover, a resource to be extracted, never imagining that the island had its own plan for his soul. The burden Arthur carried was not one of poverty, but of profound, hollow wealth. He moved through the world with a sense of superiority that acted as a suit of armor, protecting him from the inconvenience of human emotion. When he arrived at his five-star hotel, he snapped his fingers at the concierge and complained about the humidity, oblivious to the genuine smile offered by the young man behind the desk. He spent his first few days in boardrooms that looked like every other boardroom in London or New York, demanding efficiency and optimization. He viewed the Filipino cultural tendency toward patience and politeness as a weakness, a sign of a slow business culture that he intended to steamroll. But the universe is a way of humbling those who think they are untouchable. The sky eventually broke, not with a drizzle, but with a violent, cleansing downpour that turned the streets into rivers within minutes. Determined to make a late-night meeting, Arthur forced his driver into a flooded side street where the SUV finally succumbed to the rising tide. Stranded in a dark, flooded alleyway, his Italian shoes submerged in muddy water and his phone dead, the billionaire realized that for the first time in his life, his money could not buy him a way out. He stood shivering in the rain, a king without a throne, waiting for a rescue he felt he didn't deserve. Through the curtain of the downpour, a small light flickered from a modest wooden house perched on stilts, just a few yards from where Arthur's luxury vehicle sat paralyzed. Before he could even call out, the door creaked open. An elderly man, wearing a faded T-shirt and a pair of worn rubber slippers, stepped out into the rain with a large, colorful umbrella. He didn't ask for Arthur's credentials or his net worth. He simply saw a man shivering in the dark. With a gentle hand on Arthur's soaked shoulder, the old man, Mang Thomas, guided him toward the warmth of his home. Inside, the air smelled of parched earth and ginger tea. The house was tiny, the walls decorated with faded family photographs and a small altar, but to Arthur's eyes, it felt strangely expansive. There were no leather chairs here, only a plastic bench and the genuine concern of a family that had very little, yet seemed to have everything. Mang Thomas's wife immediately draped a clean, though frayed, towel over Arthur's shoulders, her eyes reflecting a kindness he hadn't encountered in 1,000 corporate handshakes. What happened next was a Malasakit that Arthur could not have prepared for. Despite the late hour and their obvious lack of resources, the family began to move with a quiet, synchronized grace. A small gas stove was lit, and soon a steaming bowl of lugor, rice porridge infused with ginger and topped with a single hard-boiled egg, was placed before him. Arthur looked at the humble bowl, then at the family who were sharing a much smaller portion among themselves. He realized that this was not a transaction. There was no bill coming, no expectation of a tip, and no utang in a lube or debt of gratitude being weaponized against him. They were helping him simply because he was a fellow human being in need. As the warmth of the ginger seeped into his bones, Arthur felt the first cracks in his icy exterior. He watched as the grandchildren laughed while playing with a handmade toy, their joy completely independent of the wealth he had spent his life chasing. For the first time, the slowness he had criticized felt like peace, and the inefficiency he had mocked felt like a deep, rhythmic connection to the present moment. His world, built on the accumulation of things, began to shatter in the presence of people who practiced the art of enough. By the time the sun rose over the washed-out streets of the district, the water had receded, leaving behind a world that looked the same, yet felt entirely different to Arthur. He stood on the small wooden porch, watching the neighborhood wake up. He saw neighbors helping one another clear debris from their doorways, a spontaneous display of Bayanihan that required no central planning or corporate incentive. It was a communal spirit of lifting each other up, simply because they were a community. When his recovery team finally arrived in a fresh, gleaming vehicle, Arthur looked at the polished chrome and felt a strange sense of detachment. He turned to Mang Thomas and offered a thick envelope of cash, his old habit of trying to pay off a debt. But the old man gently pushed his hand back, shaking his head with a smile that carried the weight of 1,000 years of wisdom. He told Arthur that a guest is a blessing, not a customer. In that moment, the revelation hit Arthur like a thunderclap. He had spent his life collecting shadows of wealth, while these people were the keepers of the light. The man who walked back into the boardroom later that afternoon was not the same man who had arrived a week prior. The contract was still on the table, the pens were still uncapped, and his advisors were ready to slash the workforce to please the shareholders. But Arthur looked at the names on the list and didn't see variables. He saw Mang Thomas. He saw mothers who cooked ginger tea for strangers and children who found joy in the rain. He pushed the papers aside and announced a new plan, one that invested in the workers' village, built a community center, and ensured that the spirit of the place was preserved alongside the profit. He realized that pakikisama, the art of getting along and honoring the collective, was a far more sustainable business model than greed. As he eventually boarded his flight home, Arthur looked down at the sprawling islands of the Philippines. He had come to purchase a factory, but he left having discovered a second home. He understood now that true prosperity isn't what you hold in your hands, but what you are willing to give away with an open heart. Arthur Sterling's journey reminds us that the most profound transformations often begin at the end of our own strength. We spend our lives building walls of silver and gold, only to realize that those walls keep out the very warmth we crave. In the Philippines, Arthur learned that a person's value isn't found in their title, but in their Malasakit, their innate ability to care for a stranger as if they were family. He learned that while the world teaches us to grasp, the heart only grows when it learns to let go. The true legend of the islands isn't found in its hidden gold, but in the unconditional kindness of its people, a wealth that can never be devalued. Have you ever experienced a moment where a complete stranger showed you kindness when you were at your lowest? Did it change the way you look at the world? Share your story in the comments below. Let's celebrate the spirit of community together.